The first 8 seconds must jolt the listener. On a muggy July night in 1842, a sound tore through Birmingham, Alabama, a sound so violent, so animalistic, that it lingered in the ears of all who heard it. A dull, wet crack, like timber splitting in a storm, only this time it wasn't wood. It was the skull of Master Elijah Mather, shattered beneath the swing of his sledgehammer. His blood pooled across the floorboards of his grand estate, and beside him stood Brutus, his enslaved man, his forced laborer, staring down at the ruin he had created. Neighbors whispered that they saw Brutus walking calmly down the dirt road afterward, hammer in hand, his clothes soaked in crimson. Some said his eyes were not his own that night. They belonged to something older, something that had been waiting. The disappearance that followed, the way the plantation was swallowed into silence, the way the church kept its distance, the way local records were quietly erased, remains one of the most disturbing buried truths in Southern history. But this story is not simply about rebellion. It is not merely about murder. It is about what Brutus uncovered, what he claimed was hidden beneath the house, in tunnels older than Birmingham itself. And it is about the sickness that clung to the land long after he swung that hammer. What follows is not a tale of freedom nor of vengeance. It is a tale of corruption buried beneath sermons, of a town that feigned ignorance, and of an act of violence that tore open something no one wanted to see. This is the story of Brutus, the Crusher of Birmingham. Elijah Mather's estate stood like a wound on the land. Built from timber dragged from Blackwater swamps and bricks baked in red clay, the house looked less like a home than a fortress. Its halls were lined with imported mirrors, polished until they reflected not just faces, but the unease in them. The Mather family had arrived in Alabama with the cotton boom, carrying both wealth and whispers. Their patriarch, Elijah, was not simply a plantation master. He was a church elder, a financier, and a man whose influence bled into every corner of Birmingham. But the soil beneath his estate was never stable. Old folk in the town said the land itself rejected the house, that it sank by inches every year, cracking its foundation. They called it the breathing ground. At night, enslaved men swore they felt the earth shift under their cabins, as though something below had rolled in its sleep. Brutus was forced to labor in these fields. He was taller than most, his muscles hardened by years of backbreaking work. Elijah called him the ox, but there was a quiet intelligence in Brutus's silence. The overseers misread him as docile, but something else was awakening in him, an unease that grew each time Elijah brought him into the cellar to move crates no one else was permitted to touch. Brutus told the others that the cellar smelled not of damp wood, but of iron, like blood rusting in the earth. And he had begun to hear a sound, faint but steady, a heartbeat where no heart should be. The hammer itself was not meant for Brutus. It was a blacksmith's tool left behind after a repair on the plantation. Heavy iron, headed, its surface bore dents like scars. Brutus first lifted it in secret, late one evening, when the overseer's shadow had passed. He gripped the wood handle, felt its weight against his palm. For a moment, the world around him went silent, as though even the cicadas had stopped. It was a silence that felt charged, humming with something older than his own breath. He began keeping the hammer hidden near the fields, just beyond the fence line. He said nothing of it to the others, not even when he noticed strange carvings burned into the tool's head, symbols not made by any blacksmith's hand. Circles within circles, an eye that seemed to deepen the longer he looked at it. Whispers spread among the enslaved men and women that Brutus carried not a hammer, but a key, that its swing could break more than wood or bone, that it could split open the ground itself. Brutus did not believe in prophecy. He believed in strength, in endurance, but he could not shake the dream that visited him night after night. Elijah's skull cracking open, and from it pouring not blood but soil, wet, red, and alive. July 1842. The storm had gathered all day, heavy clouds pressing low over Birmingham. Inside the estate, Elijah Mather drank from his decanter, his sermons dripping with cruelty even when no congregation sat before him. Brutus had been called into the house to move barrels into the cellar again. He hated the descent, the lantern's light catching on walls that seemed to pulse, as though the bricks themselves were breathing. That heartbeat, low, steady, patient, throbbed louder that night, and then Elijah struck him, a sudden backhand, sharp and wet, splitting Brutus's lip, For a moment, the world tunneled to silence. Brutus reached for the hammer. The first swing was thunder, louder than the storm outside. Elijah staggered, his jaw shattered. The second blow cracked through his skull, spraying the cellar walls. By the third, there was no face left to recognize. The storm swallowed the sound of violence. Upstairs, the housemaid swore she heard a scream, but when she peered into the hall, all she saw was Brutus climbing the stairs. His eyes hollow, the hammer dripping, his footsteps too calm. He walked out into the storm, past the cabins, past the fields, straight into the dark of the road. No one followed him, because in that silence in the cellar something else had begun to move. Brutus was seen last on that rain, heavy road, hammer in hand, walking toward the tree line. Several enslaved men claimed he whispered something as he passed their cabins. Not in English, not even in the African tongues their grandmothers once spoke, but in a sound like stone grinding against stone. By morning, the estate was silent. The overseer and the housemaids found Elijah's body in the cellar, his skull reduced to pulp, but Brutus was gone. There were no footprints leading past the tree line. No broken branches, no signs of struggle. It was as though the storm itself had swallowed him whole. For weeks, search parties combed the forests. Dogs caught a scent near the Cahaba River, but refused to move closer, howling at the banks as though warning their handlers of something unseen. Some said Brutus had drowned. Others swore he had dug into the earth, as though returning to something buried beneath Birmingham. The most disturbing testimony came from a child, an enslaved girl named Miriam. She claimed she saw Brutus standing in the field 2 nights later, hammer raised. But when the lightning flashed, he was gone. What lingered in the darkness, she said, was not a man, but a shadow taller than any tree. Elijah Mather's death should have sparked scandal, but instead it was smothered by the church. The Reverend Josiah Hale, head of Birmingham's First Baptist, gathered his elders and declared the event a private tragedy. No sermons were delivered. No mention was made of Brutus. Instead, the congregation was instructed to pray for silence. Behind closed doors, the church moved quickly. Witnesses were threatened, papers destroyed. The cellar of the Mather estate was sealed in brick. The official record stated that Elijah had died of a sudden illness. His skull, shattered into fragments, was quietly buried in an unmarked grave, but rumors bled through the cracks. Why had the Reverend ordered the cellar sealed rather than cleansed? Why did workers refuse to lay bricks past a certain depth, claiming the soil was too warm, too soft, like flesh? What the church understood, and what it hid, was that Elijah's death had not ended the disturbance. It had awakened it. Parishioners began reporting dreams of a hammer striking endlessly. Children woke screaming about a man with no face, and the cellar, though sealed, still echoed with a sound. A heartbeat, steady and patient, waiting for the next swing. In the courthouse archives of Jefferson County, there should be ledgers documenting the Mather estate, its enslaved population, and its eventual dissolution after Elijah's death. But those pages are gone torn out, replaced with blank sheets that smell faintly of mildew. Historians searching decades later found references in private diaries. A merchant in 1843 wrote that the Mather plantation was abandoned by decree. A schoolteacher noted that children were forbidden to speak Brutus's name. One doctor who treated the overseer after he collapsed from fever scrawled only 4 words in his journal: "It's under the ground." Yet there are faint traces, stubborn stains history could not erase. A newspaper clipping, half burned, refers to a hammer murder. An inventory list ends abruptly, as if someone had snatched the pen from the writer's hand. And then there is the strangest fragment of all, a church hymnal preserved in a private collection with a handwritten line in the margin beside Psalm 94. The line reads, "The crusher walks still, his hammer strikes beneath us." The official story was silence, but the earth itself seemed determined not to forget. In 1845, 3 years after Elijah's skull was split open, a new institution rose on the outskirts of Birmingham, St. Orlia's Orphan Home for Colored Children. Officially, it was funded by anonymous benefactors. Unofficially, its bricks came from the dismantled cabins of the Mather estate. Children who grew up there remembered the building as wrong. The floors creaked like bones. The walls exhaled cold air at night, even in summer. They whispered that the foundation had been laid atop something hollow, an echoing chamber beneath the ground. Several orphans claimed they saw a figure pacing the halls at night. Not a priest, not a caretaker. A giant, his head bowed low to avoid the doorframes, his shadow spilling into every corner. Some swore he carried a hammer that dripped not with blood, but with soil. The nuns dismissed the stories as nightmares born of trauma. But letters from one sister, unearthed decades later, tell a different story. She wrote of finding clay footprints leading from the cellar to the children's beds. She wrote of a sound at night, dull, rhythmic, like steel striking flesh. She begged the church to shut the orphanage down. Her letters were ignored, and within 5 years, St. Aurelia's was shuttered without explanation. The children were scattered. The building was bricked up. The records vanished. Only a faint warning was left carved into the stone above the doorway. He waits below. In 1851, workers expanding the cemetery of First Baptist uncovered something strange beneath the soil, an iron hammer, its head etched with crude, circular symbols. Though rusted, it seemed impossibly heavy, as though the earth itself clung to it. The reverend at the time, Josiah Hale's successor, ordered the hammer buried deeper, beneath the foundation of the church's new wing. He claimed it was a relic of sin, but masons reported a disturbing phenomenon when they tried to set it in concrete. The mix refused to harden. The cement bled cracks within hours as though rejecting the object. One mason, a man named Henry Claiborne, refused to continue the work. He told his wife he had seen a shadow looming at the edge of the churchyard watching. That night he woke screaming, his skull pounding as though something were striking it from the inside. By dawn he was dead. The coroner described the injury as cranial collapse. Though there was no visible wound, the hammer remained buried. The church wing was completed. But parishioners swore that on storm nights, the walls vibrated faintly, like the echo of a blow that had never ceased. By the 1860s, Birmingham had grown into a city. Yet among its black community, whispers of Brutus never faded. Those who had once been children in St. Aurelia's scattered across the South, carrying memories they could not shake. One woman, interviewed late in life, recalled how every door in the orphanage would rattle at the same hour each night. 3 strikes, then silence. She claimed the figure of Brutus was not violent toward the children. Instead, he seemed to stand watch, as though guarding them from something worse below. But not all memories were gentle. Several survivors spoke of dreams where Brutus's hammer fell not upon Elijah but upon them, one by one, their heads bursting like rotten fruit. They awoke with bloodied noses, migraines that lasted days. In 1872, a freedman named Isaac Turner told a journalist that the Crusher of Birmingham was not a man at all, but a spirit bound to the hammer, a force that had been awakened the night Elijah's skull broke. Isaac's words never saw print. The journalist disappeared days later, his notes found torn to pieces, soaked through with rain. The children's memories were fragmented, contradictory, but one detail never changed. They all remembered the sound. A slow, steady pounding, like a heartbeat, following them through the years, as if reminding them that Brutus's work was not finished. In 1878, faculty at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary received a shipment of rare manuscripts from Europe. Hidden among them was a text in Latin, older than the Reformation, whose margins were inked with cryptic diagrams. The book described the vessel of the crusher, a ritual hammer said to awaken the heart beneath the clay. Seminary archivists compared the drawings to the strange circles etched into the iron hammer found in Birmingham's churchyard. The resemblance was undeniable. One professor, Dr. Archibald Wren, began an obsessive study. He believed Brutus's act had not been rebellion, but ritual, that his swing had broken more than Elijah's skull. Wren's notes, later discovered hidden in a locked drawer, speak of a covenant sealed in blood, and the body beneath Birmingham that dreams through the ground. Students whispered that Wren began carrying a hammer of his own, striking it against the stone floors late at night. The seminary dismissed him quietly after several undergraduates complained of waking to headaches, their ears ringing as if struck from within. The book itself was confiscated by the church and locked away in a vault. But Wren's final note remains the most chilling: the hammer is no tool, it is a door, and doors do not stay shut forever. By the 1880s, Birmingham's steel and rail industries were booming. Hundreds of black laborers, many of them freedmen, toiled in tunnels carved through stone and clay. More than once, workers claimed to uncover strange hollows, chambers that seemed to pulse with warm air, smelling of rust and blood. One foreman, desperate to keep the crews moving, retrieved a forgotten hammer from a church storehouse to break through stubborn rock. Within days, 3 workers were killed in accidents no one could explain. One crushed beneath a collapsing beam, another found with his skull caved in though no tool had struck him. The third vanished entirely, leaving only a puddle of clay, red water. Survivors swore they heard the blows echoing even after the hammer was put away. Deep, resonant strikes, as though someone beneath them was pounding to be let out. Railroad companies buried the stories, branding them as superstition. But the tunnels where the accidents occurred were sealed permanently, marked with crosses painted in white lime. To this day, no train runs through them. The earth refuses to stay still there. As decades passed, Birmingham's oldest families, the Hales, the Mathers cousins, and the Clays, maintained a quiet pact of silence. Each had lost someone to the curse of the hammer. Each avoided the subject with a terror that bordered on reverence. But fragments leaked. A Hale descendant burned his family Bible after discovering a handwritten confession that his grandfather had been among those who sealed Brutus's hammer beneath the church. He claimed they heard the heartbeat for weeks afterward, louder each night, until the floorboards shook. A member of the Clay family, drunk at a gathering, once blurted that Brutus was no man at all. He was the land, and the land will take its payment. He was silenced quickly, ushered into the night. Within a week, he was found dead near Red Mountain, his head crushed by what coroners called a falling rock. No rock was ever found. By the turn of the century, the pact had hardened into tradition. No family member spoke of Brutus. No one mentioned the hammer, but children overheard enough to inherit the fear, and fear, as history teaches us, has a way of remembering what men try to bury. In 1903, Birmingham opened its first major charity hospital. It was built, unknowingly, or perhaps not less than a mile from the old Mather estate. Almost immediately, patients and staff began reporting strange disturbances. Nurses claimed that the walls of the basement ward trembled softly at night. Instruments left on tables would rattle in a slow rhythm as though moved by invisible hands. Patients suffering head injuries screamed when wheeled below ground, clutching their skulls, crying out that the hammer is coming. One doctor, a skeptic, placed his stethoscope against the basement wall. What he heard made him drop it in horror. It wasn't pipes. It wasn't shifting stone. It was a heartbeat. A slow, deliberate pounding that echoed like iron against flesh. The hospital's board dismissed the reports as hysteria, yet within 5 years the entire lower wing was shut down. Records cite structural instability. But in private correspondence, a surgeon confessed, "We hear him walking at night. We cannot stop him. The dead are not dead here." By 1911, whispers of Brutus had resurfaced in Birmingham's black community, woven into sermons about deliverance and hidden suffering. But one white priest, Father Edward Mallory, insisted the legends were demonic lies. Determined to prove their falsehood, he entered the ruins of the bricked-up orphanage one storm. Heavy night, he never returned. Parishioners later found his journal, soaked through in the mud outside St. Aurelius. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled in a hand unsteady with terror. "The hammer is not his. The hammer is the earth's. Each blow is the ground remembering, and it remembers us all. His body was never recovered." But children in the neighborhood whispered that on storm nights, a figure in a tattered priest's cassock could be seen pacing near the orphanage ruins. His head hung at an unnatural angle, as though struck from behind. In his hands, they said, he carried a hammer too heavy for a man to lift. In the 1920s, Birmingham saw the construction of Red Hill Sanatorium, a facility for the mentally ill. Its location, directly on the red clay soil where Elijah Mather's cotton once grew. The patients complained of dreams they could not escape, dreams of a giant man without a face standing over their beds, his hammer raised but never falling. One patient clawed at her own skull, shrieking, "He's inside, he's inside." Another tore apart his mattress in search of the knocking heart beneath the floor. Doctors called it mass hysteria, but attendants swore they heard the sounds too. 3 strikes every night at the same hour. One orderly quit after he discovered cracks running through the tiled floor of the ward. The cracks were not random, they formed a circle, etched with symbols. The sanatorium operated for only 13 years before being quietly shut down. Its ruins still stand, half swallowed by vines. Locals say if you press your ear to the broken tiles, you can hear it. Not madness, not memory, but the sound of a hammer striking steadily from somewhere below. In 1934, an archivist named Lillian Carrington was tasked with cataloging the scattered, forgotten records of Jefferson County. In a box mislabeled "Miscellaneous Deeds," she found a brittle envelope marked only with the letter B. Inside were fragments, a burned newspaper clipping describing a hammer murder, a hymnal with the line "The Crusher Walks Still," and a map of Birmingham with one property circled in red, the Mather Estate. Scribbled across the margin was a note, "Do not dig, he is waiting." Lillian, intrigued, traced the estate's location. To her shock, it lay beneath the very soil of Birmingham's central business district. Banks, shops, and offices now stood over the ground where Elijah Mather once bled. Within weeks, Lillian began to suffer crippling migraines. She told colleagues she heard a knocking sound at night, echoing through her skull. One morning, her neighbors found her collapsed in her parlor, her head fractured though no weapon was present. The coroner listed it as an accidental fall, but her files were seized, sealed, and never spoken of again. By the 1940s, the surviving Hale and Clay descendants had scattered, but one heir, Margaret Hale, remained in Birmingham. Neighbors described her as reclusive, her curtains always drawn, her windows boarded. In 1947, she summoned a young pastor to her home. She confessed that her family had sealed Brutus where no man should tread, and that the hammer still struck beneath the city's streets. Her last words, according to the pastor, were chilling. It wasn't vengeance. It was an opening, and the opening is wider now. That night, her house collapsed without warning. Rescue crews found her crushed beneath beams, her skull shattered in a manner eerily reminiscent of Elijah Mather's. Some swore they heard 3 dull blows echoing from the earth before the collapse. Her death silenced the last family line tied to the original ceiling, but it also unleashed the rumors once more. Locals whispered that the curse no longer lingered in the soil of one estate. It had spread through the veins of Birmingham itself. The decades that followed were marked by deliberate silence. Historians avoided the subject. Churches refused to acknowledge it. The name Brutus was spoken only in hushed tones, passed as a warning to children. Don't go out in the storm, don't walk near the clay, don't listen to the knocking. But silence does not erase. In the 1950s, construction workers digging foundations downtown unearthed a hollow chamber. They reported foul air rushing upward, heavy with the stench of rust. The foreman ordered it sealed immediately. That same night, 3 men on the crew were hospitalized with severe cranial fractures, though no tools had struck them. The incident never made the papers, yet the workers' families insisted they heard a sound outside their homes for weeks afterward. 3 strikes, then silence. 3 strikes, then silence. A rhythm too steady to be coincidence. Birmingham grew. Skyscrapers rose. The past was paved over with steel and glass. But beneath it all, the sound continued, muffled yet insistent, like the city itself was breathing with something it could not contain. Today, almost no trace of Brutus remains in the official record. His name is absent from archives. His act is erased from textbooks. The hammer, if it still exists, lies buried beneath concrete and sanctimony. But listen closely on storm nights in Birmingham when thunder rolls over the red clay hills. Some residents still report hearing it, a dull, deliberate pounding echoing beneath their basements, beneath their beds, the sound of something massive, patient and unrelenting. 3 strikes, then silence. Historians call it myth, the church calls it blasphemy, but the ground remembers and the ground does not lie. Brutus, the enslaved man who crushed his master's skull, did more than strike for freedom. He struck open a door, one that has never fully closed, and the thing behind it still waits, its heartbeat swelling through the clay, its hammer poised in the dark. The Crusher of Birmingham is not gone. He is not finished, he is not dead. The hammer still falls.